All right, guys, time to go over the last bit of notes. Probably just going to try to get all through these today. So it's late medieval to the Renaissance. So like the 1400s on to about the 1530s and 40s in bits and pieces. We'll cover the Renaissance more in depth in the fall. So, the economic effects of the Crusades have lasting impacts on Europe, mostly with it introduces new products into Europe for the nobility and for the peasant class. Um, so, as I stated before, the Middle East is called the Middle East because it's in the middle of the East. The Middle East usually had access to the trade goods of India and even China. They had silks, spices, porcelains, fine clothing, um, textiles, and cotton from India. And as the Crusaders went along and developed their own independent kingdom, and the Italians were getting rich off the monopoly they had on the trade, the Europeans got acquainted with these products and they had a high demand for them. New luxury products typically drive people wild. It's the same thing today with gaming systems and cars and iPhones. People want the latest and the fanciest and the best. And to facilitate this trade, the Italians had to change economic practices because the economic practices in Europe were not advantageous to trade. The Catholic Church had a hard stance against what's known as usury. Um, Usury is charging high interest rates on loans. And what I mean by high interest rates is the ability to turn a profit off of a loan. The church really frowned upon that. That's where we get the stereotype of the Jewish banker from. I'm sure most of you are aware of the Jewish stereotype that they hoard money, and that stereotype comes from the Middle Ages and the fact of the Jews didn't have a hardline stance against the usury. So if there were banks being operated, or if there were moneylenders operating within Europe, typically they would be Jewish because they were able to keep in line with their religion without the fear of being kicked out of the population. Never forget that the Catholics, even today, still have the threat of excommunication if they go against hardline Catholic doctrine. So, Italy, being the home of the church and being home of the rising merchant class and becoming one of the wealthiest regions in Europe, slowly ease off of their hard stance on collecting interest on loans, allowing banks to form. And these banks are very important because most people don't have the capital or the money to start a business from scratch. Even today, if you want to start a business, typically you have to go out and get a loan, prove that your business is going to be viable. They didn't have that back then. They would just take all your things and just go on with their lives. But banks start to arise in Europe, and these banks typically would fund maritime expeditions to acquire trade goods. And it starts off just trying to go to the Middle East and trade. And because the Italians have the monopoly on the Middle East, other maritime kingdoms within Europe, such as the Spanish and more formidably at first the Portuguese, have to find other avenues of trade. Most typically at first, Africa, the Portuguese make it to India first, but the Spanish do accidentally discover America again. Also, I'm sure most of you know this, but Columbus was not the first European to go to America or even settle in North or South America. Well, South America, South America, yeah, the Europeans in the 1500s the first to do that. But the Vikings actually made their way to Newfoundland in Canada and had a little settlement there till it died. But banks start issuing letters of credit, and it's the same way. And think of it as just like a credit card. Credit is just putting an IOU against yourself and getting the money now. It's like J.G. Wentworth. You need cash now. The letters of credit are used to fund whatever expedition you planned on doing, whatever business you wanted to start, and the banks would give you the money, and they would expect you to pay it back with interest or money that you pay off the original loan. And to help with this, Arabic numerals start taking precedence over Roman numerals and other forms of numerical keeping in Europe. Pretty much accounting is invented. I know that's the most exciting thing you're going to hear all day, but they invented proper accounting to keep track of all the money that they lend. And then everybody started doing expeditions. And yeah, uh, Italy, city states, Florence, Venice, Genoa, Bologna, Milan. Typically, these city states would be centers of wealth, and they were ruled independently. They weren't part of a kingdom. It's city states just as the Greeks had. So there was a baseline Italian culture that was in line with other Southern European cultures, but each of these cities developed independently, and they were how Northern European or Western European nations such as France, Holy Roman Empire, and England would get their trade goods. Eventually, these civilizations would want to get the trade goods on their own, and they branch out. Germany really doesn't do it since Germany is not a unified country until 1871. But they have all this money, and they start the Renaissance. They make wiener statues again. Also, you have some people writing some ideas down in books. One of them is Niccolo Machiavelli. He is a Florentine political theorist, and he writes a political treatise called The Prince. A political treatise is just a book of ideas about politics, and he writes a book about it, and the book's about how to properly rule if you're the king. And pretty much it boils down to it's okay to be a jerk as long as you get the job done. Um, it's okay to lie, cheat, and steal, murder if need to be, break your promises, um, make make deals behind people's backs as long as you can ensure the safety of your people. It tells you to do good if you can, but if you have to be evil, be evil. Also, it maintains that the ends justify the means. I have to beat that into your head because that's what the SOL always asks about it. Not that I would know, because I would never know what's on the SOL, because that would be cheating. And also, you have Renaissance artists making Renaissance art. These rich merchant families have all this money, and they want to show how sophisticated they are, and how much the Pope should not be angry at them for hoarding a lot of the wealth by commissioning religious art and paying a bunch of really creative dudes to make art for them. It's called the Renaissance. It's like a rebirth of knowledge in Europe. Let me see how much time I have before I go on this rant. We have a lot of time because I'm just blasting through this. So with the Renaissance, there's this common notion that when the Renaissance happened, everybody got super sophisticated and in tune with themselves and the art man, and everyone's a free spirit. The Renaissance was very secluded. It didn't affect everyone. It didn't even affect all of Europe at the same time. There were two waves of the Renaissance. You have the Southern or the Italian Renaissance happening first, and then 80 years later, those ideas moving to Northern Europe, where you have the Northern Renaissance, because historians love giving things cool names. But Renaissance artists such as Da Vinci, who painted the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper, or Michelangelo, who sculpted this statue or painted this ceiling, made art. You also have other famous artists such as Donatello, Raphael, Botticelli, so on and so forth. But you also have the Renaissance affecting literary work as well. You have this Italian fellow named Petrarch, and he is a humanist scholar. Humanism is just a focus on the earthly. It's more secular. A lot of scholars during the Renaissance want to figure out how things work instead of just saying, well, it's because God made it it's the way God wills it. You have advances in medicine, you have advances in engineering, you have a resurgence of Greek and Roman architecture and culture. They built a giant tower in Pisa, and it nearly falls down, and rich people pay for it to happen. This is The Veruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. Oh man, we're almost done. Yeah. Eventually, the Renaissance makes its way up north, and we call it the Northern Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance effects are different because by the time the Northern Renaissance reaches France and Germany and England, there's an event known as the Protestant Reformation happening, where there are divides in the church. And one thing, one important invention that happens during this time is the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. Gutenberg didn't invent the first printing press. Movable type printing presses actually already existed in China. He just made a more efficient one for the Europeans. And the Northern Renaissance focuses more on secular work, and their art reflects it. It's mostly portraits and landscapes. And you have this fellow named Erasmus who writes The Praise of Folly, where he makes fun of the church, so they execute him for it. And this fellow named Sir Thomas More writes a book called Utopia, where he talks about a perfect society that is hopefully achievable, but it's actually not. And yeah, that's the entirety of the notes. We're done for the year. I hate all of you. I'm gonna post these on Echo sometime and post the work. Just to reiterate, I hate all of you. Have a great day.